Okay, guys. Um, sorry, I had an FE spasm there. Um, okay, so simple question, and I think in philosophy, um, we philosophy of thought, meaning the philosophy of how we think and what underlies our thinking and what thought is. Um, the question is, can we have thought without language? And since thought must have preceded language, then yes, we can have thought without language. But thought must have preceded language. Um, so it seems that evolutionarily speaking, and thinking in terms of how must have progressed over time developmentally, yes, we can have thought without language because thought must have come first. However, I think that in many ways, language and the development of language and the advancement of language may have also advanced thought in many ways and clarified thought and made it more clear. Um, I was having a conversation with a friend about Hegel, and we were talking about how without the self, right? So without the division between self and the world, there would be no self. So without divisions and borders between things, there are no things. And so the divisions and the borders between things make having different discrete objects possible. Without borders between things, there are no things. And everything bleeds into each other and becomes. So in any case, at least on a perception level, if there are no borders between things, then well, okay. So I made that point. But in the same way that the borders between things help us clearly identify the differences between them and the fact that they are different things, words almost function as a way for us to draw the boundaries between things when engaging in perception or when thinking about something. So the so that's the thing. Yes, you can have thought without language because the thought must have come first, evolutionarily and historically. But I think in many ways, the advancement in language and the development of language also advanced and developed thought. And it's because, in the same way that without the borders between things, there are no things, without words, we can't effectively draw the borders between things. We can't effectively identify discrete objects. We can't, without nouns, we we struggle to put our finger on what the thing is because then it starts to bleed into everything similar to it. So if I'm right now I'm looking at a bottle, right? So if I didn't have the word bottle though, right? If I didn't have the concept of bottle, which is tied to my language, right? My familiarity with the language, I may have the concept. So this is why you can have thought without language because there are plenty of people who are mute and are incapable of language learning, but they can still think. So on a empirical level and an evolutionary level, we can definitely say scientifically that yes, you can have thought without language, but on the level of how when you're trying to put yourself into the head of a person generally, and you're trying to engage in hypothetically play around, maybe put yourself into the mind of another person who doesn't have language and doesn't have the word for that particular thing, or maybe doesn't even have the category. then everything might bleed into something, into everything similar to it, and you can't effectively discriminate between discrete objects anymore. Hence, and if you can't, and since that's a big part of thought, identification and reasoning as a process of identifying discrete objects, if that's a part of reasoning in many ways and thought, and language is fundamental to that, then yeah, you can't have language. You can't have thought without language in that way, or at least not sophisticated thought. So, yeah. But certainly the formation of thought, the thoughts as, in terms of how we form concepts, right? So thought must have come before language. So you can't have thought without language. And it was thought that built language and developed language and discovered that we can attach, and maybe, I don't know, maybe other animals do it too, even though they can't speak. Maybe they have language even if they don't have speech, right? So the difference between speech and language is an important distinction to make. Other animals may not have speech, but they may have language, right? In the sense of inside, right? It may not be an auditory. I mean, they may have a voice inside their heads by which they categorize. So a dog may look at, I don't know. So you get the point. Right? So there's a difference between language and speech. And even animals without speech, could have language. So of some kind, of some primitive kind. But I think the distinction there is very valid. Regardless, even if, evolutionarily thought came before language, it's not always clear that it would have advanced at the level that it has without the development of language. And I don't know, the impulse of a primitive human looking at something. I mean, certainly, primates were making noises and stuff before. So we already had the impulse. The primates we evolved out of were making noises before they had language. They may have had language, but that's not formalized language or speech or anything like that. So they were making noises. So we always had the impulse to make noises with our mouth, right? How we then connected the two, we thought, oh, okay, so I then can create an association. So I can use a sound, right, to identify an object, and then communicate the fact that communicate that identification to someone else. But the impulse so we already had the impulse to make noises with our mouths and everything like that. I mean, that's not the same thing as language or speech or anything. Maybe it's, yeah, right. So that's just noise making, right? So it's mouth noises it's not language and that's not speech, because I mean, other animals make noises with their mouths all the time. We wouldn't call that. Maybe it's, sure, in many cases it's a form of communication. And I just said they can have language without speech. We're getting into the weeds here, but regardless, the impulse it's fascinating how it occurred to us as humans to eventually, I can make these noises with my mouth, and then I can choose, I can associate an object with one of those noises. And then that way, trying to get across because the impulse to communicate was there before, right? So language probably did come from the impulse to communicate, right? So we're social animals, and other animals communicate with each other all the time in primitive ways. So the impulse to communicate was there. The ability to make noises with our mouths was there, as primitive primates and cavemen, or however you want to imagine it, So we had the impulse, we could make noises with our mouths, and as primitive animals and whatever we evolved out of could do that, and they had the impulse to communicate with each other, and so they probably had, and thus possessing the power or possessing the ability to make these types of noises with our mouths, and having the capacity to and then also having the ability to the impulse to communicate. So the ability to make these little mouth noises that we do combines with the impulse to communicate. Then we just start, right? Start making noises to each other, and then we're, you know, and then who was the smart ape that decided, okay, well, I've got this bottle of ketchup right here. Of course, they didn't have bottles of ketchup when they were evolving, but let's just, I'm pulling at a prop. Okay, so impulse to communicate is there. Language hasn't developed yet, or sophisticated formalized language or speech or anything like that. But there's the impulse to communicate with your tribe and your family relations. And there's the ability to make all these little mouth noises, probably before they were kind of doing that to appease each other and, using tones rather than words to express emotion, right? So in many ways, dogs have the ability to pick up on intonation and to infer what we mean by something based on our intonation, what we're saying. So they listen to us, and they harsh, heavy noises are taken as anger or frustration for dogs. Lighter, I can't make a light or playful. I can't do it. I don't have the FE for it. But regardless, lighter, more playful, they'll pick up on that. More high-pitched noises, they'll recognize that as happiness, positive. So heavy, harsh, downward intoned, or taken as negative, higher pitched. So it's not surprising that dogs may even have a proclivity then for women rather than which have a higher register with the voice, because the dog's more primitive mind may associate the deeper voices with the negative emotion, and the higher pitches with the positive. So they may be more attracted to women because their tone, the tones, intonation of the pitch of their voices exudes a kind of positivity for dogs. But in any case, we have the ability to make to communicate with tones like that in a primitive way. Now, why? It was just the development of the mind that facilitated the development of language, because we had the impulse to communicate was already there primitively. The ability to make noises with our mouths and to express emotion with tones was there, right? So, but a little bit more of a sophisticated process is going on when then we can create categories. So it was the development of the ability to categorize things in the mind that then led to language, because then it's, well, this is a bottle, this is a stick, this is this is a cloud, and this is a tree, and this is and so then these category systems, and so it developed with the kind of probably very rapidly, we, before language and before formalized speech, we've got, and language is an object, it's a system of categories, right? It's constrained by definitions and by grammar and by all these types of formal rules and definite. But in any case, it had to be the ability to form categories and then to develop concepts. So it was just the further, because with what we evolved out of, they had the ability to, again, they had the impulse to communicate with each other, communicate their emotion with making tone noises, right? Communicate with tones, and they and basic emotions like approval or disapproval. It's like he expresses disapproval or something like that, and I don't know. Whatever it was in their minds, but impulse to communicate is there, right, in the species that we evolved into or out of. With each other, impulse to communicate with each other is there in a primitive way, expressing emotion with tones. And then the ability to make these types of mouth noises. And mouth noises is not a term that I came up. I think it was Terence McKenna who I heard that term from. He kind of coined that term, looking at languages as I think the phrase he uses is small mouth noises, and they become more intricate, as we develop the ability to then, I mean, so much intelligence was behind the development of language in terms of how we convert our thought into specific motor. It's a process by which it's abstract, but it also activates your motor, the motor cortex as well, because you're having to, so much intelligence went into then taking a particular, uh, you're flexing your vocal cords, and you're moving your to create words. You're engaging in stoppages and startages, and they're of different intervals, and you're moving your mouth in different ways to create the particular sound that we then used to becomes words can exist in the mind without the ability to create sounds. But regardless, the amount of intelligence that was involved in figuring out how to communicate with each other that way, by becoming ever more deft at, differentiating different words by different, using different, moving your mouth in particular ways, or starting and stopping at different intervals, and then emphasizing at certain lengths and not at others. It's just a very deft and delicate process, and we just take it all for granted. It's like I'm talking right now, and there's no thought that goes into it in terms of all the motor processes that are being involved. My brain's activating and engaging in. It's just, that's fucking mind blowing. I mean, as well, because it's like, geez, I mean, there's just so much that I'm not conscious of in this process of trying to explain this. I mean, as I try to take all this and put it into speech, then I can't. If you start to think too much about what you're doing at each point in speaking, it's we don't. In any case, so yeah, we definitely have thought preceded language, and so, but with the species that that we evolved out of, that became human, which we define humans as having these more abstract capacities, these more conceptual capacities, and just more, not more advanced cognition, just different cognition. Maybe focused on something else, or maybe it is more advanced. I don't know, depending on whether you want to use that word or not. It may not be the most politically correct word to use, but it probably is more advanced in terms of the, its utility and its complexity. But regardless, that's a very interesting topic. It's whether, I mean, yeah, certainly thought precedes language. Therefore, we can have thought without language. But, well, maybe I'm wrong. And I mean, I take that conclusion for granted, right? That if thought comes first, if thought comes before language, then you can have thought without language, but maybe not. Maybe we didn't start thinking until we started talking to ourselves. So maybe they go hand in hand, right? Maybe when thought starts, language starts at the same time, rather than one coming before the other. Maybe they're simultaneous. So it's just an error of logic on my part, but a reasonable assumption, but not a formally logical, not a formally logical assumption. But in any case, yeah, but yeah, I think in many ways the advancement of language allowed for the advancement in thought, and it's because it allowed us to not only categorize things and draw the boundaries between them with words, but then to be able to communicate with each other about our observations and our perceptions about things. And so, It's a lot of people would just say, yeah, I convert my thought to language. And so, yeah, you can have thought without language. One preceded the other. So sure you can. But it's like, actually, it's not so clear that one preceded the other, right? It's an intuitive assumption, but it's not necessarily a logical assumption. And they could have started at the same time. But I do think that the development in thought must have been propagated by the advancement in language and our ability to more articulately draw the boundaries between things with words and then to be able to communicate. So thought doesn't really occur in a vacuum. I mean, the fact that it serves the purpose of then if it can't be communicated, then I mean, I was talking with one guy about something like this in the past, although it wasn't a conversation on this. It wasn't a philosophical conversation, but it sort of touched upon this issue. That I think he said something like, if it can't be expressed, if the thought can't be expressed, it isn't worth thinking, which I disagreed with. I thought, well, no, it's not that it's not worth thinking. It's that it's just not worth expressing. If you can't express it, then it probably isn't worth expressing, which then I step into hypocrisy when I say that, because at least 70% of the thoughts I have, I can't express. In any case, that's a big estimate. Probably that's not true for anyone. I'm being hyperbolic. It's more like, I'd probably say like at least 20% though of the thoughts that I have, I can't really readily express in words, which then also speaks to the fact that, yeah, you probably can't have thought without language, because we have moments all the time where we can think it, we just can't say it. So, but usually those thoughts are really not very clear, you'll notice. If you have a thought that you can't express, it usually isn't exactly clear what you're thinking about or the full dimensions of what you're thinking about. So, it's, yes, the fact that we have thoughts all the time that we can't put into words doesn't prove that you can have thought without language, because oftentimes you can't put it into words because it's simply not a very good thought, probably. And it's not easily compressible into formal speech. So, but yeah. Now, I mean, thinking in terms of like, I really liked that idea of how at one point all language was a way for us to communicate more primitive emotions with tones rather than with words, and how the use of tones to communicate then evolved into the use of words to communicate. And so there was an increase in the complexity of the speech, literally, because tonal communication ends up being very simple, expresses basic emotions like anger, sadness, approval, disapproval, basic emotions and emotional responses. Whereas, so there's a literal increase, depending on how you define complexity, um, in communicating via tones in a primitive way is much more, is less complex than um, what speech ultimately becomes, communicating with words rather than just with tones. And then we will, so with communicating, but see, we can still communicate. A big part of our communication is still very tonal. So we can, communicate with, we can, what's the way of putting it? See, I'm having one of those thoughts where um, I'm not having an easy time converting it into speech. Like, what was I talking about? Anyway, yeah, I mean, I forgot we're talking about, like tones and how there's an increase in complexity from communicating just with tones to words. Oh yeah, but we lace our word communication, so we use words to communicate, right? But we will lace that um, with tones as well. So we'll use tones and intonation to express emotion as well as thought, and so um, the tones are reserved for expressing the emotional aspect of communication, and then words more for more for the thought aspect of communication, the process of identifying concepts or identifying facts, if you want to call them that, apparent facts, right? So, I mean, there's a distinction there. I mean, right? So we can recognize something and see, yeah, this is an apparent fact. And it's great that I came to that distinction because I have that problem all the time. I want to say this is a fact, you know, because there's authority in there. Well, there's not authority, but there's clarity and certainty in being able to say, yes, this is a fact, but I've gone too deep into like knowledge and its limits to be able to say that anything is necessarily a fact better, but it's rather than having to say, see, when I say this is a fact, I feel like I'm coming at it with too much, in too absolute and certain a way. It doesn't express that the uncertainty inherent in the issue we're discussing. So really, it's the difference between saying this is a fact and then this is an apparent fact. Because yes, it's apparent to me that this is a fact. It doesn't mean that it is. It's just an apparent fact. So that's an important thing to think about too. But regardless, I really think that that the question of is thought something more than language, and is it interesting, and then having to draw the distinction between the two. But my first inclination as a materialist and an empiricist is to say, yeah, of course you can have thought without language. One preceded the other. Duh. Right? That's a very easy conclusion to fix yourself in. In reality, it becomes much more complicated, and then you begin to think, oh, well, you put yourself, again, that would be an apparent fact. But if you begin to put yourself in the mind of someone who doesn't have language, it becomes more difficult you're looking at the objects around you. It's like, if I don't have any words to express what they are, well, then I don't know what it is. So, in many ways, knowledge probably is, language is probably a necessary condition for the development of knowledge too. And so knowledge being factual statements about the nature of reality. And so if we don't have language, right, if we don't have a category system for discriminating between objects and engaging in object-oriented programming and identification, then the boundaries between things dissolve and everything bleeds into everything else. And there's nothing is anything if everything is anything, and everything is everything. And, so we can't be too quick to make the judgment that you can have thought without language. We really have to think very critically about whether it's actually possible to have one without the other. And, this links back to, because I think I was watching a video, or at least saw it in a video title, the idea that how does grammar link to consciousness and how does language link to consciousness, something like that. And I just think what I thought about that was that, grammar and language is consciousness transmuting itself into speech and into it's consciousness communicating itself is what language is. And grammar and language and the rules of language is just a structure that we accept as valid, right? Because I could just use, and that's the thing. Language is this system that we assume, but it's not. You can't really question the frame in that regard with regard to language. If we're going to use it and it's going to be useful, we have to assume that it's valid. We can question within that frame, but ultimately we have to accept that there are usages, even if the usages are invalid. For instance, take the word supernatural, right? So when we refer to the supernatural, we refer actually to something that is supranatural, meaning beyond natural. We say supernatural, which actually would indicate that it is more natural, being supernatural. So when we're referring to the supernatural, we're referring actually to the supranatural. But when we refer to it as the supernatural, we actually contradict ourselves, because the supernatural is inherently not supernatural. Yeah, so the supernatural is inherently not supernatural. And so that's just one way in which words end up contradicting their meaning, and they, but we have to work within that frame, and it's language becomes a structure, a formalized structure, and grammar is a formalized system, and language is a formalized system in which we take consciousness and we convert it into, well, one way of putting it is to convert it into thought, right? Because consciousness maybe even seems to be something more than thoughts, right? I mean, is consciousness thought? And, certainly thoughts are a part of consciousness, but are they one and the same thing? It seems that they aren't identical, that they don't share, that thought and consciousness are two separate things, because oftentimes thoughts can be very unconscious, and isn't that interesting? So, thought and consciousness is not necessarily the same thing, indicated by the fact that oftentimes thoughts suggest an impressive lack of consciousness. But then again, humans often demonstrate a lack of, because we always assume that we're conscious, and that, right? And, that's where we just take that as, yeah, we have some level of consciousness. I mean, the thing is that I am making a mistake there, because, yeah, we're conscious on some level, right? We're not conscious on every level, every possible level, and of every possible thing at every possible time simultaneously. We have, our consciousness is structured by our consciousness is limited by our limited attention. So there's a difference between, well, and this distinction is not, so I've definitely come across the distinction in my learning between consciousness and attention. There's a difference there. And attention seems to be the medium through which we arrive at consciousness, but it is not one and the same thing. Now, other people may have different thinking about that. It's just like, so, and again, without words, right? So if I didn't have language, it would be impossible for me to be able to categorize and then make any of these distinctions. It would be impossible, right? Which speaks to the fact that I can't advance any thought if I don't have words to advance the thought, to develop the thought, to define what I'm thinking, to identify what's relevant in the thought process and what's a part of it. And without that, I just simply don't have anything in my arsenal. So, very interesting question. And I'm not exactly sure if this, I guess, would be the philosophy of linguistics or something like that, or if this is not linguistics. Now, linguistics is a very interesting field too. I don't exactly know how much they cover in linguistics, the physics involved in linguistics and the biomechanics involved in linguistics. Because there's it's fascinating to think about all of the motor activity going on when I'm speaking, and how intricate the sounds become and how intricate the mouth movements become. And I'm wondering how much they get into the biomechanics of speech in linguistics. I think I'm not exactly even sure. Like, okay, let's look up the formal definition of, and see, we're using language right now to define exactly, trying to isolate and triangulate around the concept that linguistics. It's funny that we have to define. I'm being too meta here. Or at least, okay. The scientific study of language. Okay, so this is linguistics then, and its structure. I wonder how much it focuses on its structure, and okay, including the study of morphology, syntax, phonetics, and semantics. Specific branches of linguistics include sociolinguistics, dialectology, psycholinguistics, computational linguistics, historical comparative linguistics, and applied linguistics. I would want to get deeper into how linguistics is defined, getting into the linguistics of the word linguistics. The traditional areas of linguistic analysis studies these phenomena, theoretical building models and their parts. It's related, so yeah, and this is another way that humans define things, is we define things comparing them to something else, so, or how they're related to something else. And that's the way that they've defined linguistics here. Linguistics is related to philosophy of language, stylistics and rhetoric, semiotics. What's semiotics? Lexicography and translation. Okay. What's okay, no, semiotics. I've never run across that word. Let's define what that is too. Semiotics is the study of sign processes, which are any activity, conduct, or process that involves signs. I see, so it's like sign language, which can be visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. Gustatory being the sense of taste. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I guess that's what this is all discussion of linguistics and more of the philosophy elements of linguistics, and then also the evolutionary. So it's evolutionary linguistics as well. So this is all, I guess, a discussion on linguistics. But what an abstract field it is. I guess it's just thinking about language, is a simple way is a layman's way of saying what linguistics is to another, or it's, well, not exactly, well, you know what it is. Yeah, right. So it's a layman's way of describing what it is to another layman. But yeah, and it's just interesting too. It's like thinking more about the topic of linguistics. Like we have so many languages that developed independently, and German, French, Spanish, Italian, Turkish, English. I mean, there's just so many different, and usually, I mean, they're very equivalent systems, language systems. So, I mean, you'll find an equivalent word in each one. And so it speaks to the fact, but again, people adapted language to serve the particular habitat and the social environment they evolved in. And so, which is why some languages may have some words and, may specifically refer to some things with a particular word, whereas other languages won't. So, that's interesting as well. And the fact that, they, now, I once people started thinking in terms of, I can use these little mouth noises then to categorize everything, and then be able to use that noise to then relate the thought that or the process of identification that's going on in my mind, and then create an image in another, with making noises with my mouth, create an image in another person's, an idea in another person's head, based upon a mutually agreed upon system of designating which noise and which sound means what, is maybe a way of understanding it. Trying to use more of my intuition right now, but yeah, and once we had the impulse to do that, to have this mutually agreed upon, set of noises and sounds that then conveyed certain things, and then we could make them, and then like I said, paint a picture in someone else's head. Once we had the impulse to do that, it wouldn't take us very long to develop very, very sophisticated language systems as systems of categories. And I guess writers are those in our species who specialize in the process by which thought is converted into language. Would be one way of looking at writers, I guess, from an anthropologist's. And like, I love this idea of like, I guess what I'm trying to engage in right now, this is exactly what I'm trying to engage in, is in one of my courses, my professor used this term. He used a thought experiment, right? Because we were thinking about, it was a ethnic studies class, and we were talking about race and the concept of race. And he always wanted to get us to think in terms of, if an alien anthropologist, were to come to Earth, how would he define things? How would he? And I guess ever since I heard that phrase, that idea of an alien anthropologist, which is thinking that way, is the source of all absurdism, But I've tried to integrate that more and more into my thinking, trying to think like an alien anthropologist and then figure out what things are at the most essential level, if understood by an alien anthropologist with no previous. I mean, we really come to understand what something is philosophically in an essential way when we do that, when we try to define what it is essentially, and that process of essentialization by which things are reduced to their fundamentals, is, I suppose, and then framed in terms of their fundamentals, is what a philosopher is in human society, and in so, like I've just framed. So in any case, but yeah, I guess this would be the philosophy of linguistics, and it's probably one of the more interesting questions that arises, is there a difference between, do we need language to think, um, and one certainly may precede the other. That's a very reasonable assumption. And certainly, I think inevitably, I did mention earlier that it's not a necessary assumption. Yes, I think thought must logically precede language, but that doesn't mean that you can necessarily then have thought without language. Right? So one may precede the other. That doesn't mean that you can have one without the other. So that's an important thing to note as well. But we're hopefully this video offered a little bit more, some more refined commentary on that question of language and thought, and trying to draw the boundaries, right? Trying to make the proper distinctions to understand the issue philosophically, and in a real world fundamentalizing sense. I don't know if anyone's watching. Maybe you could pose a question or two or three, maybe on the topic or a related issue. Although no one really watches these live streams, they're more like video diaries, or video reflections. I still will occasionally, although I only do it, and I mean occasionally. Actually, occasionally isn't even the right word for it. I will occasionally remember to leave some time open if anyone wants to pose an issue or a related issue or a related question, or just troll, which I'm totally fine with as well. But so that I can maybe go off into other dimensions of the issue that I had not considered. Maybe also what I'll start doing is summarizing at the end of each video, although I don't really have a good enough memory, I think, to go through every point that was made. But uh, or maybe I do. I really don't try to. It's not that I don't have a good. It's not that I have the memory to do it. Probably I'm just too lazy to do it because if the longer the video, the more points I'd have to manually go through and consult. You know, having to go through it and then trying to remember and order your day according to what you did is a difficult task. It's a very manual process by which you have to very, and who knows how our brains even remember. I mean, like, if you were to ask me, now I'm getting off on another issue. I don't want this to become too tangential, which is why I'm going to restrict myself. But and the length of the video needs to be limited for other utility reasons. But uh, the fact that oftentimes when we think, all that we need is an intention behind our focus. So when you're trying to remember something, like you ask me, remember what you did today. It's like, I'm thinking when I'm doing that, right? So I'm thinking about my thinking now. When I'm doing that, I'm I'm focusing my attention intentionally. So there's an intent there that guides all of the interest. So it's interesting how oftentimes when we're trying to get to a solution, problem solve, remember, do anything that requires, right, us to demonstrate, what our brain has been processing throughout the day. All that we really need to get an answer is to just have the intention behind it, behind our focus, and then that will lead us to the solution or to the. So that's interesting too, although that's entirely tangential. And this also gets into outright pseudoscience, but we don't really understand. That gets more into phenomenology, the phenomenology of thought and psychology. And it's actually not really a pseudoscience. It's just something that we have not really gone too deep into. We really only understand how the mind works on the physical level, and we don't really understand where thought comes from. And we can describe it as just impulses in our nerve cells and, transmitting across, chemically saturated uh, axons and dendrites, and that leads the electrical impulse to the next. But on a physical level, I mean, it's meaningless, right? Where does the content of the thought come from? And there's a metaphysical element to it. And so we're getting into more metaphysics. But in any case, if there are no questions or any related issues, I'll probably keep this open for another 2 or 3 minutes. I will be back. Okay. I will close the stream now then. Thank you for watching.